I'd like to talk with you today about something that we youths often tend to shy away from, and that's the topic of spirituality. It's kind of a mushy topic, but the way I plan to talk about it might be different than what you think. Here's what former president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, Peter Morales, said on the subject. He said, "For me, spirituality feels like connection to myself, to others around me, to the earth and all of creation. Connection to myself feels like deep peace, awareness, calm, authenticity. Connection to others and the world around me feels like compassion, community, acceptance, and enduring love." The idea of connection is central to everything that I believe in. And I think the reason it's so important is because of what Peter Morales said. Connection feels like compassion, community, acceptance, and enduring love. When I think about the extraordinarily challenging times we're in, I try to think about them from that point of view. From the point of view of making connections and being connected, and particularly about being connected to community. Because connections to community, especially diverse, committed, multi-generational communities like our congregation here in Anaheim, and like all the congregations where I've been a member or those I've served over the years, connecting with those communities gives me a powerful and sustaining spiritual feeling, the sense of a deep and abiding bond. These are the kind of communities that are always there for you, to help see you through the good times and the bad. Communities filled with loving people who would bring you a casserole when you were sick or grieving, give you a ride, or visit you in the hospital. Of course, all the great spiritual traditions teach the value of connection with others in community, often made through worship or service. But I don't have to tell you that in times like today's society, our connections are seriously frayed. At the same time, engagement with communities that help build and sustain those connections is waning, in some cases disappearing entirely. The decline of religious institutions began in the 1960s and 70s and really accelerated at the turn of the current century. 20 years ago, 42% of Americans could be found in their house of worship on their holy day. Today, that is down to a third. Attendance at religious services has declined for a whole host of reasons. Needs left unmet, church scandals, the culture offering more options. Maybe some of you can remember when church was the only thing happening on a Sunday morning. As a religious educator for most of my career, I watched as more and more families chose to go to soccer practice instead of to church. In the 80s and 90s, it was like a slap in the face as sports leagues scheduled practice and games at the same time as church services. For decades, we've been seeing attendance drop in traditional religious institutions. And I don't think it's coincidental that along the way, we have also seen the rise of alienation, loneliness, mental health issues, radicalization, and violence. Many of us wonder if our society can heal from this unraveling. But let's take a look back in time and see how the whole religious thing started. The example I like to use is from the Reverend Robert Latham. He wrote, "Back when humans sheltered themselves in caves, there was little to ponder except survival in a savage and terrifying environment. But then came art and language and communities of meaning were born. Critical to making meaning were the compelling questions about the mysteries of existence. Yet survival was a full-time commitment with little energy left over to pursue these questions. So there arose an institution in the midst of community whose purpose was to enter this cosmic mystery and return with answers that gave meaning to human existence and direction to those human communities. At first, this institution was often actually just a single person. They were called by many names: shaman, priest, sage, imam, prophet, lama, rabbi, minister, teacher, etc. Over time, the institutions grew and were given the name religion, which means to bind together, because that was precisely what its answers did for the community. So religion and its answers to life's mysteries became the holy enterprise, the sacred pursuit that infused communities with a sense of meaning and purpose on the earth. While Reverend Latham describes them as sacred pursuits, unfortunately, it didn't take long for those holy enterprises to be corrupted, their sacred missions to be twisted by things like greed and lust for power. Who can ignore the ill effects that have followed the actions of many organized religions down through the ages? The countless wars, grotesque scandals, and terrible injustices. And yet, even in the face of all those negative byproducts, religious institutions have lasted and even thrived throughout the centuries. Reverend Latham says they have survived as long as they have because of the human need to answer existential questions. Questions like, where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? These fundamental questions exist across every culture on earth, and they have existed through time. They stem from the instinctive human desire to explore our beginnings, the natural world, ethical conduct, the reason for our existence, and our ultimate fate. Yet, as I say, today those institutions are crumbling. People are looking elsewhere for connection that I'm calling spirituality. In nature, in yoga studios, in meditation retreats, and in many other places. And while those can all be wonderful ways to nurture one's spirit, for the most part, they don't supply that connection to a committed multicultural community that I mentioned before, that strong and lasting connection that would see you through the good times and the bad. And so we find ourselves in a place to one similar to William Carlos Williams wrote about in his poem, Asphodel, That Greeny Flower. He wrote, "It is difficult to get news from poems, yet men and women die miserably every day for lack of what is found there." In his book, Soul Boom, Why We Need a Spiritual Revolution, actor and comedian Rainn Wilson quotes this poem. And then he says, we could easily switch out the word poems and replace it with the word spirituality. And then it would go like this. It's difficult to get the news from spirituality, yet people die miserably every day for lack of what is found there. I don't know if you've ever watched the TV show The Office. Rainn Wilson is the actor who played the character Dwight. And you might ask, what's a comedic actor doing writing a book about religion and spirituality? Turns out he has actually done a lot of thinking and living out his spiritual life in the Baha'i faith, a faith that, while very different in important ways from ours, like not affirming same-sex relationships, it does have a number of things in common with Unitarian Universalism. It finds wisdom and meaning in many faith traditions. It emphasizes democratic decision-making and equality between women and men, and it has a vision of world peace. Wilson points out that we have tried to solve worldwide problems like the mental health crisis, economic injustice, racism and sexism, nationalism and militarism, loneliness, the emphasis on material possessions, and the granddaddy of them all, climate change, through politics, legislation, and economic solutions. And if there's one thing I think people from all points on the political spectrum can agree, it's that none of these quote-unquote solutions have actually solved very much of anything. And that's why Wilson advocates that instead we try a spiritual approach to these intractable problems. And so he has invented his own religion called Soul Boom. Why try such an approach? One reason is that scientific studies show that a spiritual life and connection to a sacred community have consistently beneficial effects on our well-being that result in longer, healthier, happier lives. Where else in today's world do we emphasize the value of paying attention to our interior lives? Where else do we make meaning beyond materialism and acquisitiveness? Where do we ask questions like, what's an economy for anyway? And where else do we confront the existential questions that I've mentioned before? Wilson says that ways of being that provide life, love, connection, wholeness, peace, and joy are actually quite simple, and that they are accessible to everyone. In fact, he says they have been and continue to be hiding in plain sight. Witness our congregation right here. And while that may be true, it's reasonable to ask what a broad-based spiritual approach would look like in today's world. What specific steps could we take that would make an actual practical difference in people's lives? In answer, Wilson distills the essence of the spiritual principles that underlie the world's major religions. Things like do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and derive a new approach from those core ideas. Now, to be clear, I'm not suggesting we use, could, or should adopt each and every one of Wilson's principles. That's not really the point, but it's a provocative proposal. It might open up a conversation about overcoming the world's ills that hasn't been attempted in quite some time. And I want to add one more thing. The disruption in our spiritual, our religious life that we are seeing across the country happens to be occurring at exactly the same time that the foundations of all our secular institutions are being shaken. Everything from Congress to the Supreme Court, to our financial system, the media, and so many more. And a few months ago, I mentioned the work of Jeremy Rifkin. He's a man who has consulted with corporations and governments across the globe, including our own, and he has delivered a radical message to us all. He says that when three crucial systems, communication, transportation, and energy, all go through a dramatic change at the same time, that is a signal that the society has entered a period of industrial revolution. And he says that we are currently in the midst of the third of such a change in the modern world. The first industrial revolution was, of course, the innovation of coal for energy, railroad for transportation, and the telegraph for communication. Rifkin identifies the second as the introduction of the telephone, radio, and TV, fossil fuels and nuclear power, and widespread use of the internal combustion engine. In other words, automobiles and trucks. Well, think about it. Today, we have the internet and AI on the horizon, our new communication systems, electric and self-driving vehicles, our emerging new transportation system, the decline of fossil fuels, leading to new renewable energy systems. And when you think about that, it's kind of hard to argue with him. And then there's a theory developed by William Strauss and Neil Howe, which looks back at human history, or at least American history. It looks back about 500 years and discovered a series of predictable cycles, each cycle lasting 4 generations. The cycles begin with a period of strong community consensus following a major crisis. This is what the US and much of the developed world saw after World War II. That period is followed by a time of spiritual and cultural renewal that culminates in rebellion against the establishment, such as we saw in the 1960s and 70s. Next, there is a time when institutions are weak and individualism is high, which may have begun around the 1980s and probably extended into the first decade of this century. Lastly, there's a period of profound crisis. That crisis undermines and eventually destroys the old order. And boy, does it feel like that's what we've been going through in the past 10 to 20 years. But there is some good news here. When the cycle is coming to an end, it always lays the groundwork to create a new one. I'm not saying that it will be without a struggle. The last time around, the community consensus followed a horrific world war, and I hope we don't have to endure anything like that again. But the next cycle is a period of strong community consensus. And I have to tell you, yesterday, when my husband Rob and I attended an absolutely huge No Kings rally at the Huntington Beach Pier, and I know many of you attended elsewhere, and saw remarkably little opposition at all, I had a growing sense of what that strong community consensus might start to look like, that the seeds may be being planted. So I want to encourage you folks, hang in there. We just might be heading into an era of strong institutional building through societal consensus. And maybe, just maybe, Wilson's book and his podcast, as well as the ongoing work of people that we probably know, like Reverend William Barber and Krista Tippett, Oprah Winfrey, Father Greg Boyle of Homeboy Industries, and so many, many others. Maybe their work is an early rumbling of, dare I call it, some sort of spiritual renaissance. Maybe they represent the initial stirrings of a conversation that can define what our religious institutions need to look like in the coming era. So I wonder about what you're thinking. Do you think that these times call for a spiritual revolution? What might you include in a new religion if you were designing it from scratch? If If humanity is going to, in fact, take on such a task, Rainn Wilson says that one of the first things that we need is a new mythology, because, he explains, stories and narratives are so central to the way our brains work. So if you'll indulge me, I'd like to give it a try. In a galaxy far, far away, there was a beautiful blue-green planet teeming with life. The planet was ruled by buffoons and ruthless dictators who served the interests of a group of greedy, self-centered billionaires who wanted to hoard the planet's resources for themselves and reduce its billions of people to mere cogs in a system, or worse, slaves. The people were to mine the resources and work the fields, while robotic technology assembled useful machines and essential goods. The masses survived in meager circumstances, but kept their spirits alive with humor and song where they could find it. Eventually, the billionaires and politicians grew complacent, and the network of people recognized their common plight and awakened to their own worthiness. They found ways to unite together across any and all differences and identities to say no more. They made jokes about the politicians. They wore frog costumes in the face of enforcers dressed in riot gear with armed military might. They demanded basic human rights, respect for themselves and their precious, fragile planet, a voice in their government, and an uplifting vision of the future. There ensued a mighty struggle, but despite the massive power of the billionaires and the cruel politicians, there were too many persistent, valorous, courageous people for them to subdue. Working together with joy and cooperation, they developed a new vision, a new society. Having good character was valued above gold. Healing and trust emerged along with compassion and service to others. Of course, their story is not over. The struggle for justice is far from complete, and perhaps the danger may never truly be past. But maybe, just maybe, a new way may be budding. And so may it continue.